The first, Australia's long been an attractive education destination for international students, especially from Asia. But could the boom times be over? Cash-strapped universities from around the world are now competing aggressively for a share of the education export market. And Asian countries are pumping billions into boosting the quality of their own educational institutions. Kesha West reports.
For the last 2 decades, Australia has hit the jackpot when it comes to international student dollars. Hundreds of thousands of students, mostly from Asia, have flooded the country's universities and educational institutions. At its peak a few years ago, international students made up around 30% of university students. In some individual universities, that number was more like 60%.
Australian universities have come to rely on this very rich and valuable source of revenue to underwrite Australian university operations.
But is all that starting to slip through Australia's fingers?
What we're seeing is that this 2-decade boom is looking like it's coming to an end, that it's reached the top of its cycle.
The first crisis to hit the country's education industry was the bad press surrounding the mistreatment of Indian students, following the violent attacks against young Indian students in 2008 and 2009.
It seems that there has been another racist attack, or at least a hate crime perpetrated against another Indian.
But that tarnishing of Australia's reputation wasn't the only problem for the industry. According to a new report by the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, tighter visa restrictions and a high dollar have worked to make Australian degrees less attractive abroad. At the same time, the global economic downturn has prompted cash-strapped universities in America, Europe and Britain to start working aggressively for their share of the education export market, in particular the Asian market.
They're having to ramp up international students to make up budget holes that they have over there. And effectively, the US universities are looking like where Australian universities were 15 years ago in terms of the numbers of international students and the rate at which they're taking them on board.
And the competition is not just coming from the West. Asia is fast becoming an education hub, and analysts agree it's only a matter of time before the Asian universities, in particular those in China, Singapore, Japan and Hong Kong, rival the world's best.
You cannot look past Singapore. Singapore has 4 universities. All of them are as good as anything that Australia has got. So as a result, Singaporean students quite often look to their own universities before they look to overseas universities.
In Hong Kong now, the government has an explicit policy to make it an education hub. What it means is that you want students coming from outside Hong Kong to study in Hong Kong and pay real tuition.
Tony Chang is president of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. The university was recently ranked the top university in Asia.
We are very international. You know, we use English in our curriculum. Our academics are mostly, international, Western actually. We found that international students, for example, from East Asia, from Europe, starting to be from even the US and Canada, they're interested to come to Asia, right, because of the economy in Asia, in particular China.
And like Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan and in particular China is investing huge sums of money in higher education.
What China is doing several things in particular to ramp up the quality of education it has at home. Yes, they've been investing in a select group of universities and pumping in billions of dollars to quickly ramp them up to a sort of world-class standard. They're also inviting elite universities from elsewhere in the world, and particularly from the United States, to set up shop in China in partnership with leading Chinese universities. This is a real revolution and a game changer for higher education.
If you go to Beijing and Shanghai, you see a lot of young Westerners, who are not just tourists. They're there to study the language, to study the culture, to look for jobs, to stay there.
India, in comparison, is hoping to become the global go-to place for IT education.
One of its most famous higher education institutions is the IITs, the Indian Institute of Technology. From what I've read, India is trying to more than double the number of IITs in a very short time.
But Melbourne University's Professor Fazal Rizvi argues there are serious problems with the higher education system in India.
India is putting in a huge amount of money, but there is a lot of debate in India whether that money is correctly targeted. What is not being invested all that much is in improving the quality. So there is an issue about putting in money, but for what purpose? If the purpose is simply to build more universities to soak up the growing demand, well, there are more universities, but they're poor universities.
Australia's universities are ranked among some of the best in the world, and as a result, they'll continue to attract large numbers of international students. But to counter the growing competition from the United States, Britain, and increasingly the Asian universities themselves, analysts warn Australia's institutions need to pull up their socks.
Now is the time for Australian universities to start to consider how to respond to these looming threats.
Sean Gallagher says they need to move up market by improving the in-class and on-campus experience for international students. But crucially, he says, they must also tap into Asia.
If you look at the centre of gravity for higher education globally, it is rapidly moving towards Asia, and particularly emerging Asia. That's where Australian universities need to start to hardwire, to embed themselves into China, to have a physical presence there. And they need to start thinking about how to do that now.